Welcome to Libyth. At the heart of the Taiheiki's concerns, deeper than any battle, more fundamental than any individual figure, is the question of what makes authority real. Not just recognized or powerful or successfully defended, but actually genuinely legitimate. The kind of authority that has a right to exist, that people are morally as well as practically bound to obey, that the cosmos itself endorses. This question was not theoretical in 14th century Japan. It was the operative question of the age, the question that every political decision, every military alliance, every act of loyalty or betrayal was implicitly answering. The Nanboku-cho conflict was, at its most fundamental level, a crisis of legitimacy, a period in which the framework that should have settled questions of authority had itself become contested, in which the very sources from which legitimacy derived had split and were pointing in different directions. The Japanese imperial institution derived its legitimacy from three sources, and the Taiheiki's world is defined by the fact that all three had become unreliable. The first source was divine descent. The emperor was the descendant of Amaterasu, the sun goddess. And this genealogical connection to the divine was the deepest foundation of imperial authority. It was not a metaphor. It was understood as a literal fact about the emperor's nature, a fact that distinguished him from every other human being and gave his authority a quality that no military achievement or political maneuver could replicate. The second source was ritual authority. The emperor performed the rites that sustained the cosmic order, the ceremonies that maintained the relationship between the human world and the divine world, the prayers and observances that kept the rice growing and the realm at peace. The third source was what we might call practical recognition, the acknowledgement of the powerful that this particular person was the emperor, expressed through their submission, their service, and their willingness to receive appointments from his hand. When the Nanboku-cho split happened, the first source remained technically undivided. There was a single imperial line, and the question was which branch of it had the valid claim. But the branches were both real branches, both carrying the sacred genealogy, and the argument between them about which was legitimate was an argument that the genealogy itself could not resolve. The second source split entirely. There were now two sets of ritual performances, two emperors conducting the ceremonies, two claims to cosmic maintenance. And the third source, practical recognition, was precisely what was at war. The entire conflict was a contest over who would recognize which emperor. The legitimacy framework had not simply been challenged. It had been reproduced in duplicate, and the duplication was the crisis. The Taiheiki's insistence that the southern court is legitimate and the northern court is therefore not a simple claim. It is a desperate claim, an attempt to restore the singularity that the framework requires in the face of an actual duplication that the framework cannot process. The text honors Go-Daigo's court, honors his generals, mourns his reverses, celebrates his returns, all while documenting the military defeat that eventually drove the southern court into permanent exile. The moral victory the text claims for the southern side is purchased at the cost of acknowledging its practical defeat. And the gap between moral victory and practical defeat is where the Taiheiki's deepest anxiety lies. The fall of the Hojo clan, which the Taiheiki records at the opening of its main narrative, provides the first and most dramatic instance of the text's Buddhist-inflected understanding of power. The Hojo had governed Japan for over a century through the machinery of the Kamakura shogunate. They had been the real power, not the shogun, who was their instrument and certainly not the emperor, who was the shogun's formal superior. They had accumulated this power gradually, through marriages and appointments and the steady exclusion of other claimants, and they had used it to run a reasonably effective government for a very long time. By the early 14th century, they were finished. Not because a single catastrophic mistake had been made, though mistakes had been made. They were finished because the system that had generated and sustained their power had exhausted itself. The land economy that rewarded loyal warriors had run out of land, and the loyalty that land had purchased was therefore running out as well. The fall, when it came, was total. In 1333, Kamakura was surrounded by forces that included men who had been loyal Hōjō vassals weeks before. The regent Takatoki and hundreds of his followers withdrew to Toshoji Temple and killed themselves. A mass suicide on a scale that the medieval world recognized as extraordinary, that the Taiheiki records with the kind of attention reserved for events that contain a whole meaning in themselves. The hundreds of men who died at Toshoji did not die because they had no other option in a strictly practical sense. Surrender was possible. What made mass suicide the chosen response was the value system they inhabited, the warrior ethos that defined honor as inseparable from the Lord's fate, that made survival after a total defeat of this kind a form of dishonor more intolerable than death. They killed themselves because within their moral universe, it was the right thing to do. The Taiheiki renders this scene with a restraint that is more devastating than any elaboration could be. It records the numbers. It records the names of those who led. It records the order of the deaths. And it records this without the editorializing that might seem appropriate to a moment of such magnitude, because the event already contains its own commentary. The Hojo, who had held the highest power Japan offered, died in a temple they had patronized, surrounded by the remains of the order they had built, with no army left to defend them and no ally willing to die with them except their own men. This is what the Wheel of Fortune looks like when it turns completely. The Buddhist reading is not imposed by the text. It is the reading that the event itself invites. Attachment to power is the source of suffering. The Hojo were attached to power as completely as it is possible to be. The suffering was proportional. But the Taiheiki's moral universe is more complicated than a simple Buddhist lesson about the dangers of attachment. The Hojo did not fall because they were wicked, though they had done wicked things. They fell because their time had passed, and the text makes this distinction, the distinction between moral failure and temporal exhaustion, with some care. There is a kind of tragic dignity in the Toshoji scene that would not be there if the Hojo were simply villains receiving their deserved punishment. They are men in whom the warrior values they professed are, at the end, actually operative, men who die as they were supposed to live. The tragedy is not that they died, but that the system that made dying this way meaningful had already ceased to function, that the values they were enacting in their deaths were the values that the age was in the process of destroying. The critique of politics that runs through the entire text, the steady, embedded judgment on rulers and institutions that the text encodes in narrative choices rather than explicit commentary, reaches its most complex expression around the figure of Go-Daigo. Go-Daigo is the emperor the text loves, the sovereign whose cause the text endorses, the man whose restoration the text celebrates and whose defeat it mourns. And yet the Taiheiki also holds Go-Daigo responsible for things he did and failed to do, in the only way available to a text that cannot directly criticize an emperor. by showing the consequences of his decisions in detail, by giving weight and attention to the suffering his choices produced, by letting the events speak what the narrator cannot say. The Kenmu Restoration, Go-Daigo's brief period of actual rule from 1333 to 1336, is rendered in the Taiheiki with a kind of muted disappointment that is the textual equivalent of a sigh. Go-Daigo got what he wanted. He overthrew the Hojo, restored imperial rule, began the project of governing Japan directly. And the result was a government that alienated almost everyone. That gave too much to court aristocrats at the expense of warriors. That reversed land distributions without adequately compensating those who lost. That pursued the ideal of imperial restoration with an inflexibility that made it impossible to build the coalitions necessary to sustain it. The warriors who had fought for Go-Daigo expected reward. They expected land. They expected the new government to understand that their service had a material price. When the Kenmu Restoration proved unable or unwilling to meet these expectations, the support that had made it possible began to drain away. Takoji's betrayal was made possible by this drainage. He did not simply turn against Go-Daigo because he was ambitious, though he was. He turned because Go-Daigo's government had created the conditions for betrayal by failing to secure the loyalty of the class whose loyalty it needed most. The Chinese tradition of praise and blame, the historiographical method that the Taiheiki inherits and deploys, operates by implication rather than declaration. The narrative choices themselves are the moral judgments. How much space a person receives, the quality of the language used to describe them, whether their speeches are rendered as wisdom or as error, whether their deaths are given ceremony or compressed into brief notation. Reading the Taiheiki this way, as a continuous act of moral evaluation encoded in narrative form, you can track the text's judgments through its attention. Kusunoki receives more care than any other figure because the text finds in him the clearest embodiment of the values it wants to honor. Go-Daigo receives care and criticism simultaneously through the technique of showing consequences rather than drawing conclusions. Takoji receives a kind of reluctant acknowledgement. His achievements are noted, his qualities are described, but the prose around him is different in texture from the prose around the figures the text loves. The Edo-period reading of the Taiheiki as a governance manual was not wrong, exactly, but it was selective. The domain lords who studied it were looking for lessons about how to maintain loyalty, how to govern effectively, how to avoid the mistakes that had destroyed the Kamakura shogunate and the Kenmu Restoration. These lessons are in the text. But the text also contains something the governance manual reading tends to suppress. The recognition that the lessons cannot be fully applied, that the conditions that make good governance possible are themselves historical and contingent, that a text written in and about a period of institutional collapse cannot finally offer the reader a reliable path to institutional stability. The Taiheiki is not a handbook. It is a reckoning. What it reckons with, finally, is the question of whether the political order can be made just, whether the structures through which human beings organize authority and distribute power can be aligned with the moral order that the text, through its Buddhist and Confucian and historiographical frameworks, assumes must exist. The Taiheiki's honest answer, encoded in its structure, and its outcomes rather than its explicit statements, is that it cannot, not reliably, not durably, not in such a way that virtue is rewarded and wickedness is punished and the right side wins. The right side lost. The loyal died. The pragmatic survived. The cosmos did not intervene. The wheel turned, and what came up was not justice but continuation. More war, more politics, more men making choices in impossible conditions, and being held to account by a text that honored their choices even when it could not save them. To read the Taiheiki now is to enter a conversation that has never really ended. The questions it asks, about what makes authority legitimate, about what loyalty costs and what it is worth, about what happens when political orders collapse and what is preserved through the collapse, are questions that remain live, remain difficult, remain the kind of questions that a civilization has to ask itself if it is going to understand what it is doing and why. The Taiheiki does not answer them. It never pretended to. What it does instead is think about them, carefully, at length, with full awareness of the suffering involved, in a way that leaves you better equipped to think about them yourself. That's all for today on Libyth. One new book every week. At least we try.